we started to hear from our students and our community that there were issues that our students were facing relative to racism, an experience that was not what we want for any of our students. And so we started to do some work, started to gather some information through our cultural liaison worker and others. And one of our vice principals at the time reached out to Dr. Zaidi, who was doing research on anti-racism and specific to literacy development and language that we use in the classrooms. And she met with our vice principal via Zoom, and then started to gather research and felt that there was something here. Expanded, and we started to gather more. She started to gather more research on the immigrant experience post-COVID, which resulted in a published paper, as well as her cultural liaison vice principal and 4 students traveling to Chicago for an international conference, education conference in Chicago, presenting their research. And then from that, we were part of producing a documentary called Bridging the Gap, which is really, it's about the immigrant experience here and the things that we're doing, the lessons that we've learned, and how we're implementing them going forward.
This is episode 55, and listen, in all of these interviews, I think the thing that impresses me most is that each of these educational leaders has a story for sure, and like a particular bias, insight, perspective that I think is what makes them great leaders, right? I talk a lot in my work about what's your unfair advantage and what is it about you that no one else can do. And I really think these interviews have helped me see those unfair advantages in all of these leaders. And every once in a while, you have a conversation with somebody where they just show a level of vulnerability that you just so appreciate. And that's the case in this conversation today with Sean Beaton, the Assistant Superintendent in Grasslands Public Schools in Alberta. And listen, I didn't mean necessarily to make him as vulnerable or feel this emotion, but it was just part of our conversation. And it reminded me a lot of a previous conversation that I had with Randy McLean from Anglophone East in New Brunswick when he talked about the impact of the Humboldt Broncos bus crash. He was vice president at the time, and the impact that had on him and still has on him to this day. And these are the things I think that obviously bring out the humanity in our roles in education. And I think it brings to light, why education is this very special kind of place, and working with children as we do has a very emotional impact that I know this was a difficult conversation maybe to have with Sean, but I was so grateful for him that he shared that. And a good way to wrap up what I'm going to call the school year, take a few months off here. We'll be back again in the fall with some more episodes, but I think this is a really good way to end. And so thank you to Sean, and hope you enjoy this conversation today. Sometimes I like to start with this because it's a good sort of level set. How did we first connect?
I was thinking about that before today, and I was talking to my wife about it. And honestly, the connection came through her because she was seconded to Calgary Board of Education a number of years ago doing curriculum redesign with CBE. She had been part of the Alberta Distance Learning System and with Pembina Hills. And so all of that brought her in connection with you, with Alec Kuros, with George, and all of those other folks that were doing a lot of work and thinking around curriculum development and looking at things differently. And that would have been like 2012-ish, somewhere in there. And then, and I'm pretty sure that's where we started to cross paths. And I started to read some of your stuff, and through Twitter and social media. I think that's probably where it all came.
Yeah, and I was just thinking, we were talking to people the other day about there was this sort of moment in time where educators had access to a lot of different people and made some of those really good connections. And of course, today it's just become more difficult. And when I think about young teachers, I always thought because when I taught pre-service, that was something I encouraged them, say, listen, you could be teaching in a small town somewhere, maybe a place like Brooks, where you just don't have as many connections as you might in other places. And even people that did teach in urban centers didn't necessarily mean that in their school they had people that they could
Yeah,
really connect with. There was that. And now I worry, and loss of
too.
community in general is challenging. But transitioning into Brooks, I want to talk specifically about, and I'm gonna come back to your personal story, but I want to start with the community itself, because you have a very unique situation in being, people just plunked Brooks on a map, they'd say, "Oh, it's just this little spot in southeastern Alberta," probably pretty rural. They could maybe picture in their mind what that community looks like. But I think if they drove through the streets and went into your schools, they'd find it's probably not what they thought.
No, and you really described it to a T from a lot of my perspective in first coming to the division. So I came to Grasslands and Brooks in 2014 after having spent close to 15 years teaching in Calgary. And my experience in Calgary was in a very affluent neighborhood. And coming here, um, I'm a city kid. I grew up in cities. This is the smallest place I've ever lived. And so I had a certain expectation of what I was coming into. My wife grew up in Brooks, so we had family here and what have you, been here, but I didn't realize the level of diversity that exists in this community until I actually got here and was involved in the school system. So we're 15,000 people almost in Brooks, and because we have a international plant, meatpacking plant, JBS from Brazil, they recruit internationally and have for a number of years. And it started with bringing in temporary foreign workers from Sudan and then just expanded. We have a population here in town that is unlike any small community in Alberta. I'd argue any small community in Canada. The diversity levels that we have here, we're pushed 45% English as additional language students in some of our schools. So southeastern Alberta, lots of folks would look at, like you said, agriculture, maybe the oil patch. And when they come and see the faces in the stores and the community, it's much different, I think, than what people originally expected.
And that brings with it challenges and opportunities. So maybe talk a little bit about
Sure.
what are the challenges with that, and maybe to start with, and then
Uh,
segue into some of the opportunities.
So I think to start, the challenge is helping families who have come from very difficult situations. A lot of them, many of our families come from refugee camps. Many are coming out of war-torn communities. And with that comes the trauma. Living in a camp or leaving war situations brings with them. So we deal with the first generation trauma of the parents bringing their kids. That's number one. And so the mental health difficulties in our community are significant. Um, Helping students come and function in English and function in a system where, for a lot of them, they had no formal education because of their situation back home. And so they're trying to do two things: understand Western education systems in English, which is a language that most of them don't have any experience with coming in. So that's a challenge in helping find success with those folks and kids. Some of the kids that are coming are 15, 16 years old. Helping them get through high school presents a very difficult challenge for us. But within that, the cultural components, the language components, which are challenging, the mental health pieces, the diverse tapestry, if you will, of the community is the benefit. I talk about this all the time about my own kid who are part of our system. I have a 21-year-old. I have a son that's in grade 8. The diversity that they experience and the interactions that they have make them better individuals and help them understand that different context and understand the human experience is not all shared in the same way. I think that's a huge strength of ours. And we talk about that all the time, that our diversity is our strength. And it just gives us, I think, a very different perspective as, like I said, of the human experience that is not all this.
We talked a little bit at the beginning about budgets and all those kind of things. So maybe share some really specific ways in which this costs money to have a diverse community. You can't just do things the way that perhaps a neighboring district might. So maybe talk a little bit about the way you've invested in supporting the diversity.
So specifically the division, since I've been in this role for the last 7 years, part of my portfolio is student mental health and wellness. And I have been given direction by the board that is a primary focus. That's one of their goals. We know that it's significant that there are mental health challenges, not just with our newcomer population, but our population in general. And so for a small division, we support student mental health and wellness to a higher degree than most of our neighboring divisions. We have in each one of our large schools, we have an intervention team member. They are a counselor. They don't provide therapy, but they provide coaching and support through mental health and wellness. So in all of our schools, we have at least one. In our bigger schools, we have two, and that could be more. So we're spending up well above $1 million a year for a very small word to provide that support. In addition, over the last couple of years, we've hired a cultural liaison worker who's part of that intervention mental health worker team. He himself was a refugee. He came out of West Africa, out of Congo. He worked with the United Nations when he was still in Africa. And when he came, he went back to school, got his degrees, and is now supporting families as a community worker. So he's embedded in our three biggest schools, but his role is to work with students at school, but also families. And so it's helping bridge some of those cultural gaps. He speaks 4 different languages. He understands the refugee experience and the immigrant experience. And that's a huge benefit to us. We've had divisions all across Canada come to us and say, how are you doing? What are the things that you're doing? Now I always go back to, it's about providing the mental health support for all of our students, as well as cultural liaison. And so those are the 2 things that kind of have set us apart. The other thing that we do that we put a lot of time, energy, effort, and funds into is our English as an additional language programs. So each one of our city elementary schools has a designated person to provide support to students. Each school does it a little differently dependent on the number of students that they have in their building. So at our biggest elementary at Eastbrook, just down the road, we have a sheltered program where students will come and work with the teacher for specific periods during the day, all on language and literacy development. And then that's the same at our Birch Junior High and at the high school as well. So those are the things that, are the day to day, and that we devote a lot of time, like I said, time, energy, and effort funds to. One of the very unique things that we have been involved in is a research study that was coordinated at Brooks Composite High School with the University of Calgary School, Workland School of Education, and Dr. Rahad Zaidi post-pandemic. And what we found, if you recall, in March and April in the spring of 2020, while we were going through shutdown, we were dealing with those components, but also the Black Lives Matter movement really gained steam in the United States and all across Canada. And here was no exception. And we started to hear from our students and our community that there were issues that our students were facing relative to racism, to an experience that was not what we want for any of our students. And so we started to do some work, started to gather some information through our cultural liaison worker and others. And one of our vice principals at the time reached out to Dr. Zaidi, who was doing research on anti-racism and specific to literacy development and language that we use in the classrooms. And she met with our vice principal via Zoom, and then started to gather research and felt that there was something here. Expanded, and we started to gather more. She started gathering more research on the immigrant experience post-COVID, which resulted in a published paper, as well as her cultural liaison vice principal and 4 students traveling to Chicago for an international conference, education conference in Chicago, presenting their research. And then from that, we were part of producing a documentary called Bridging the Gap, which is really, it's about the immigrant experience here and the things that we're doing, the lessons that we've learned, and how we're implementing them going forward. So that was screened 2 weeks ago in Calgary. We had an amazing event screening it, and then we screened it here last week to about 100 people. And it's just, again, it's telling the story of the human experience here in the division that's very unique. But places like Peel in Ontario, CBE, we've had international school divisions come and talk to us about, what have you learned? What are you doing? And how can we do?
Fascinating. And if we can, will there be a link for that documentary available?
I can share some. Right now it's It is a pay link, but it's very reduced rate right now. But I can
Yeah.
send that.
I think people may be very curious to see that. So
Absolutely.
the one
Happy.
thing, I think the one thing that I think is fascinating is when we talk about some of these issues. You mentioned Peel and some of the larger districts in Ontario. They have been down this road for a longer time because their populations have been very diverse, a lot longer than yours have.
Yes, absolutely.
In addition to that, it's no secret that Alberta is a very conservative part of the country and rural. Again, without stereotyping anyone, it's
Sure.
just a fact that I grew up in rural Manitoba. It was as white can be.
Yeah.
And I had a handful of kids in my own that were looked anything different than I did. And so I wonder if you can even speak to some of the ways in which racism exists everywhere. There's nobody that's immune to that. So I just wonder about even that dynamic of the conservative, rural,
Mhm.
white part of Canada and having to deal with that. I think we can anticipate, but I wonder if there was just even I'm looking more at the positive outcomes. What have you seen
Yeah.
from that host community that has said, hey, we're excited about having these folks here and it's making the city better.
So I have a very specific example to relate to that. Last week, when we did the screening here in Brooks, it was an invitation only event, but we had a number of community members come that represent different organizations. We had both municipal government, so our county councilors were there, city councilors, and mayor, and what have you. And so it was a diverse crowd. I had a community member come up to me at the end, older community member who'd been here for a long time, who said, I didn't know this was all going on. I had no idea that this was the work that you were doing. And she said, it makes me proud of our community. And for a person of, and I'm going to stereotype it, of her generation to say that, I think reflects on, again, telling the story. And that's the starting point for us is that everybody, regardless of where you started, has a story to share. I have a story, you have a story,
Sure.
and it's part of our cultural makeup. It's part of who we are. But we need to, I think, to recognize that all of those stories are valuable. All of those stories should be heard, and they're different. And that's okay. I think when we encounter, and unfortunately, I've had to deal with situations where folks have called in and been upset about something we're doing, and whether it has a racist undertone or not, it's difficult conversations to have. And I peg it down to fear. And it's often fear of the unknown. And that's why we believe that telling the stories and sharing that information is so significant. We had last week and over the last couple of weeks, all of our big schools in town here have had cultural day. And I was at the one at our high school, Brooks Comp, last week. And there were Ethiopian students, there were Latina students from all throughout Central and South America. We had food, we had dance, and there was a Western exhibit as well, where one of our families, that is their ranching family, farming family, brought in their roping dummies, steer roping, and everybody was trying it. So you had a very interesting. I wish I had a photo of it. Juxtaposition of a student in traditional Sudanese clothing with the rope, trying to rope this model steer in the gym. To me, that's the marriage that we're looking for, right? That's it. It's not putting one culture above or beneath. It's together and representing that we all have a story and it's all valuable. And I think that's what we're trying. Um, we may not achieve it with everybody in the community, and that's a fact. But if we can change it for the generation that's coming up and empower them to be able to tell their stories, I think that's success.
No, and I think that wise of you to acknowledge that some of these changes, they take time and you might not see everything happening all at once, but you're establishing a culture that can sustain itself for years to come because the likelihood of Brooks remaining very diverse is pretty highly likely. And so
For
all
sure.
of these kids are going to grow up, they're going to work with, they're going to live with. The older woman that you spoke of earlier, she didn't grow up with this. And so the change is hard. But for our kids, hopefully we can help them move forward with a lot more
Agreed.
empathy. And can you maybe share, besides this story, which is, I know, a big part of the Brooks story, the Grassland story, what are you most proud of in your district?
Oh, um, that's honestly, Dean, I will say, and I think I said it at our screening last week, that I am most proud of the division in being willing to be open to address the issues that we see and not shy away from them, willing to have tough conversations, willing to engage with each other in ways that are sometimes very difficult. And I know you said maybe not attached to the diversity and what have you. It was really hard to separate that because I think it goes across not just our city schools, but we're diverse across the system. We have students that are, low German Mennonite students. We have Hutterite colonies. It's the diversity that we bring throughout our system. I'm incredibly proud of, and the willingness to do the work and to be engaged. Uh, I think that's amazing. But outside of that, we have one of the things that I've been involved in at Brooks Comp. We have a teacher, and in any situation, in any initiative, you need a cheerleader. You don't have that, things die on the vine. We know that. I don't know his name. Dave Brown is his name. He thought an opportunity to develop a CTS program, Career and Technology Studies program, focused on 2D, 3D animation because he had a few students that were really interested in it. What's happened over the last really 5 years is we've devoted funds to providing those students with cutting edge technology related to 2D and 3D animation. We've got these drawing tablets, and I could go through the tech specs, but I'll get them wrong, but that are industry standard for film production or anything to do with 2D, 3D animation. And they are winning awards provincially, nationally. We have students that are competing internationally at skills in related to 2D, 3D animation and game development. We formed a partnership with Vancouver Film School and other kind of smaller think tanks where that work and training is going on. And now we're being recognized. And him and his, I won't take credit because it's not mine, helped to make it happen. But we just had, he and another student were in China preparing for Skills International, which happens later this summer. So that's something
Nice.
that I think we are incredibly proud of.
I think that's the advantage of if you're not taking advantage of your size, you can speak of the negatives in terms of resources, but the ability to be malleable and take advantage of opportunities like that, I think is serves you well.
This episode is brought to you by Advanced Learning Partnerships, also known as ALP. We are a professional learning consulting group that serves communities across North America. We are partners, designers, and agents for change. You can learn more about the work we do at alplearn.com. And now back to the show.
Question I like asking folks is talk about a leadership challenge. As you told the story, I could weave in there certain things that might have been challenging, but maybe you think specifically of something that when you look at your own leadership journey, you mark that as being, that was a really challenging time. And, you've maybe had a chance to reflect on how you emerged from that, hopefully a better leader.
Think about challenges that won't make me emotional. I think we had a board meeting last night. I was speaking to one of the trustees about, as a classroom teacher, you are responsible for your students, whatever you have in your class, whatever that might be. They're your responsibility, and you advocate on their behalf to your administration to support them. When you become an administrator in a school, that circle expands. Now you're advocating for your staff, your students in the entire building. When you get into these roles, and we're looking at the entire system, and I'm advocating on behalf of everybody in that role. And I think one of the things that I did not anticipate was when coming into this role was the potential impact of a student death. So it's in my first year in this role, we had two very unfortunate incidents happen to two of our students. One was an accidental drowning, and the second was a death by suicide. And I'd never personally gone through that as an educator in this role. I had colleagues and what have you go through that, but the impact of that event and some of the other pieces associated with it, because it was obviously in those situations, it would be an understatement to say it's complex, but there were exacerbating pieces too. that required investigation. And we were part of that. And that was probably, not probably. I said I was going to try not to get emotional. That was the single most challenging event I've gone through. And so we think about how those things make you a better leader. To me, it comes back to the stories, to being able to tell the story, both of that young man, but also all the people that were involved, and to advocate on their behalf, because there were some things that were very difficult to go through. And so you learn to try and, as much as possible, and I'm not doing it right now, obviously, is to compartmentalize and to be able to look at things very objectively. I wasn't able to do that until I think after that. I go back to that situation and look at what did we do really well in supporting the family and supporting the community, and how did we do it? And it's the ability to almost, and this sounds very cold, but I think in some cases you have to distance yourself, put your own feelings aside, because I knew him, I taught him, I knew his family, and be able to support everybody involved. And I think sometimes for leaders in these roles, if you do that over and over again, but never come back to, it's like trying to nail Jello to a wall, it leaks eventually. And so I think what I learned from that is that if I have to park my own emotions to support others, that's my role and responsibility, I believe. But at some point I have to go back and address my own feelings, emotions, what have you, or I can't continue. I'd be no good.
I mean, it does raise a really fascinating dichotomy, if you will, because I think, listen, those kind of situations puts so many other things that you deal with way down the list of, guys, these are not important things. I've used and heard people use the phrase that, almost everything we do in education, no one's going to die. Like, we can try a lot of things and we can deal with those things. Right. But what you're talking about is, this is actually the part of this that, like, number one, you didn't anticipate, and number two, like, this is as serious as it gets. And I think to have the ability to show empathy, to be human, and to cry, and to mourn with everybody, the positive thing, and yet at the same time, to be able to, as you described, distance yourself, to be able to say, but things have to get done, and that even in serving other people, things have to get done, not just from a technical or a housekeeping kind of thing, but like, there's things I need to support other people in different ways. So I think that, that's a really fascinating, and again, sorry that happened, and that's tough to go through, but also fascinating in terms of understanding that through a leadership lens. And again, I couldn't even begin to tell you all of the things, obviously, that you experience and what that's like. I just think it's interesting. So if I could transition into your role in maybe helping others begin their leadership journey. And when you think about that, what kind of advice would you give to your younger teachers who are thinking, maybe I'd like to be principal one day or work at the district level? What would you tell them in terms of, here's the things that you should think about as you begin to develop your own leadership skills?
So the number one under the umbrella of don't take things personally. So much of what we deal with, the phone calls, the emails, whatever, the meetings where people are upset and they're elevated, their emotions are high. For the love of everything, don't take it personally, because 9 times out of 10, it has nothing to do with you. And I think that goes for teachers, administrators, anybody involved in education. Don't take it personally. And that's so difficult when you're getting called names or yelled at or what have you. That would be my number one umbrella piece of advice. Underneath that, I will share that when I worked in Calgary, I worked for a principal, Don Andrews. And Don he was cowboy. He was team roper. He was the quintessential cowboy, big man, 6'5", huge guy, but one of the softest, a teddy bear kind of human. And I remember being in his office, and I don't remember what I was complaining about, but I know I was complaining. And he said to me, "Mr. Beaton, you do not need to attend every argument to which you are invited." And I will never forget. And I've used it with as a parent. I use that. Our kids do that all the time. Like
Sure.
I tell people all the time that kids will often give you 100, 1,000, a million, whatever it is, reasons to give up on them. Don't. You don't need to deal with everything that they're telling you, that they're coming at you with, because they're looking for something. Behavior is a communication tool. And I think if you can get to that point where, yeah, I'm not going to do, I don't need to react to everything, and I don't take this all personal. So much of the noise goes away. And then back to what I said about the student debt is then you can start to compartmentalize and look at, what do I got to do first? What do I have to do next? So those two things together have made me a far better leader, a far better person in dealing with what we deal with day to day. My final piece of advice to prospective leaders would be confident in managing ambiguity. When we started before you press record, I said, I had things happen. Like we walk into the office, you have a certain plan, or you walk into your school and you have a certain plan. I'm going to do this observation. I'm going to get this done. I'm going to call this parent. And then your world explodes for whatever reason, and you have to shift on the fly. Be able to manage them. And it's going to be a long road.
Yeah. No, those are really good piece of advice. And I think about that, the first one about not taking things personally. That was a lesson I remembered learning when I taught first grade. Listen, when a 7-year-old says something to you, they're 7, they're 6. And yet, I don't know, maybe it's just human nature that when they say they hate you or whatever that is, kids say that your own kids will say things like that to you in a lifetime. But yeah, not to take it personally, yet we do. So yeah, and I think that's real. I always find that fascinating, especially as I talk to different leaders. I've asked it in the form of like, how do you, because it comes into the thick skin part of the conversation. Like I can't take everything, and I have to be able to diffuse and realize that most of the things that people say to me and about me are not for me and about me. They're about a situation, and you just happen to be the person that gets the brunt of it. And then again, as you talked about, building the empathy that goes with that as part of it, and just accepting the fact that it's not a very linear thing. And I think in education, I think that's the great training of being a classroom teacher, is that you understand that it's a human thing and it's not simple. Like we're always trying to work towards simplifying the learning and education experience. And I don't think that's possible. I think it's inherently complex because we're humans, and learning itself is inherently complex, and we just have to accept that. And we work towards creating structures. But yeah,
I think to reinforce your point is that I think you look at a lot of the narrative that's going on in education, perhaps outside of the classroom and more in the research side. And there are groups of people that are trying to come up with a scientific method of teaching and learning, that it almost to create a logic path that it's if then this will take place, which fine. I think there's a place for that, but it discounts the nuance of the art of teaching and a human experience and understanding how those interplay together.
No question. You've actually tossed out a couple names already, which I love in this one, and you could use those ones, or you could pick somebody else, but I'm inviting you to pick one person in education that you're grateful for. Don't give me there's so many. I get that. There's a billion people. Nobody has just one. So I know this is a hard question, and one that people don't even like really, because they feel like they're going to be missing. You're going to miss out a lot of people. But if you can think of one person that potentially could listen to this and hear their name, that would be even better. But give me one person that could be something really small that they've done for you recently, or somebody in the past that you're grateful for.
Yeah, I could go as well. I've had lots of mentors. I've had lots of people that have helped and what have you. But I'm going to go back. I'm going to say Don Andrews was probably the single most influential individual in my early career. that he made me a better teacher. He made me a better administrator because I can hear him in my head all the time. And I doubt he's going to hear this, which is unfortunate. I've said to my wife, Laura, lots because she worked for him as well. I have to reach out to Don and share this with him because he comes up for me all the time. I quote him. Clearly, he had a significant influence, excuse me, in what I do. And yeah, he shaped a lot of how I looked at teaching and learning, particularly in my early career, but then as I was a school-based administrator. But think of other people that your go-to, when you have a situation, you have a problem, who's your go-to? And outside of my own office, because we are very team-oriented, and my superintendent, Scott Brandt, is always a voice of coaching and what have you, and he doesn't, the person I'm going to name doesn't probably know this, but is Mark Davidson, who is currently the superintendent in Medicine Hat Public. He's leaving Medicine Hat. He's going to BC next year. But when I think of big issues that have come up, and I want that second voice, that second look at it outside of our context, he's my go-to. I phone him all the time, or I'll text them. Hey, what would you? And so, in this role as assistant superintendent, when senior leaders, that he's a go-to. Another one I could name that is the contrary voice. That I know if I phone him, I'm going to get probably different thinking than what I'm doing right now, which I appreciate. Is Nigel McCarthy, the director of education for Lloydminster Catholic, and he and I have known each other for a very long time. He worked in Calgary when I was there, and I know if I pick up the phone and ask him, I'm like, it's going to be a bit of a different viewpoint, and I like having those.
Well, you completely broke the rule. It was supposed to be one. You gave three. I don't know if I gave you a prize or gave you a penalty, put you in the penalty box or gave you, I don't know what, but no, those are all excellent. And I like the differentiation between what all of those can have and offer you and why you're grateful. And that's
just
fantastic.
You asked about advice for new leaders. And I think I'd like to add that have the people know who you can call, that you don't want confirmation bias. I don't want people to tell me, oh yeah, you're right all the time.
Yeah.
If I am, great, but I want people to give me the opposite.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's awesome. Okay, so let's just wind her down here, if you will, with a couple of little bit more, less maybe challenging questions. What are you reading or listening to today?
Right now, I am rereading Good to Great. I read it when it first came out years and years ago, but there's just so many little nuggets in that book that are reminding me, that come back to it. I have currently almost finished rereading it. But another very influential book is Principal Leadership for Racial Equity. That's had a huge influence on my thinking in running schools, in looking at how we orient systems to promote equity, to ensure that, again, everybody's story has a place and hold space. Those are the two.
Good. Those are great. And again, I think the idea of revisiting some of these books that are, like I read Good to Great too, 15 years ago or whatever.
Absolutely.
And then to even see, these are principles that still stand and these are ideas that are still relevant. I think that's something that we have to probably all get better at, instead of just picking up whatever is the newest. Well, when you're not reading and learning, what are you maybe watching that's a little bit of a guilty pleasure, or I don't want to think about anything right now. I just want to watch this dumb thing or whatever it is. Like
I ripped through, and I just finished Shogun on Disney. And again, it's mindless. You can shut your brain off for an hour, but boy, it was a good story. It was very well done. Hope they do a season 2. And then right now, unfortunately, my other guilty pleasure is watching my Edmonton Oilers. I've been a lifelong Oilers fan, and I'm not real confident right now.
It's tight. Maybe when the time this gets released, it'll be really good news.
We'll see what happens, right?
Yeah. I think everybody, well, I shouldn't say everybody, some people don't, but I'm just looking for one of those two to finish it all off and get a Stanley Cup back in Canada. Would be amazing. All right. This week, in fact, I am driving through Brooks, Alberta, heading out to the mountains to go on a golf trip. If I were to stop in Brooks, what should I stop and see and do?
It really depends. So if you're stopping and staying. You don't have to get back on the highway, and you can enjoy an adult beverage. We have a fantastic brewery here in town. It's local folks that were mechanics and had a dream and thought through. It's very successful. It's called Piston Bro. Great people. If you're just stopping for lunch, you got to go for barbecue. We have one of the best barbecue restaurants that I have ever eaten at outside of the U.S. Here, again, local guy. His wife was local. He came to Brooks from Vancouver. He was in fine dining, had a food truck that was barbecue, turned it into a very successful restaurant. Really great guy. Go see Jesse at home.
Okay. Those are good recommendations. Both of them. Sean, thank you for your time. This was really good. After having done about my 55th episode or so, I'm really seeing a very strong relationship between many of the Alberta folks. There's definitely a level of comfort that I have with you all that I think is really powerful. So I appreciate that and appreciate your time.
No, I appreciate it, Dean. And thank you very much for reaching out and letting me do this. It's excellent.
Absolutely.
Thank you.